My old bones failed me, sending me flying from the top of the stairs. My daughter Jennifer rushed over, glowing with false concern. She already saw a new house, mine, of course, as a kind of investment. I knew her game, saw through the pretense, for the blood of a predator ran in her veins. But I was no fool either. Years of teaching young minds at the correctional center had given me a unique skill for reading people, their secret motives. And when she hired the young physical therapist, I immediately recognized that face, those eyes, full of the same old boyish stubbornness. She thought she could buy him, but I had already written the report in my head long ago. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of this queen-sized bed, a rectangle of starched white sheets that had become both my prison and my entire universe. Before the fall, I had commanded spaces, halls, offices, entire wings of buildings. Now, the few feet from my mattress to the bedroom door might as well have been a mile of broken glass. My name is Everett Blackwood. I am 78 years old, and for 34 of those years, I was the director of the Northwood Correctional Center for Boys. I dealt in structure, in consequence, in the unblinking assessment of character. I learned to read the subtle tells in a young man's posture, the flicker of deceit in his eyes, the carefully constructed edifice of his lies. My hip, however, had offered no such warnings. It had simply given way, a catastrophic failure of engineering on the third step of the main staircase, sending me down in a clatter of brittle bone and surprised indignation. Now, a deep, tectonic ache had settled into my right side, a constant grinding reminder of gravity's victory. From my position, propped up by a mountain of pillows that smelled faintly of lavender and disuse, I had a clear view of the room I had shared with my wife, Sarah, for nearly 50 years. The sunlight, thick with the dust motes of a lazy Tuesday afternoon, cut a sharp golden slash across the hardwood floor, inching its way toward the claw-footed mahogany dresser. I watched its slow progress, my internal clock, honed by decades of rigid schedules, marking the passage of another useless hour. Every object in this room was a ghost, a repository of memory. On the nightstand, beside a glass of water I could not quite reach, sat a framed photograph of Sarah. It was taken at Miller Pond, the year before she got sick. She was smiling, her head tilted just so, the wind catching a stray wisp of her silver hair. Her eyes, even in the faded photograph, held a warmth that this house had not felt since she was gone. I spent a long time looking at that picture. I analyzed the curve of her smile, the light in her eyes, trying to distill the essence of her, to hold it in my mind as a bulwark against the encroaching silence. The silence was the worst part. This house, once filled with the sounds of her life, the gentle hum of her sewing machine, the clinking of porcelain as she set the table, the soft notes of the piano she played in the evenings, was now a vacuum. The only sounds were the groans of the old structure settling around me and the frantic dry rustle of autumn leaves skittering across the roof. I had grown accustomed to the quiet after she passed, finding a sort of stoic peace in my routines. My days had been ordered, methodical. I would rise at dawn, brew coffee in the old percolator, read the newspaper from front to back, and then spend the morning in my garden. I knew the name of every rose bush Sarah had planted. I knew which ones needed pruning, which ones were susceptible to black spot. It was a system, a set of problems with tangible solutions. My work at Northwood had been the same, just with boys instead of flowers. I had seen them come in, broken and angry, and I had applied the principles of discipline, education, and unwavering consistency. Some took root, others withered. But it was all a process I could understand, and to an extent, control. Now control was a foreign concept. My body, once a reliable if aging machine, had betrayed me. My mind, however, remained sharp, a warden pacing the cell of my own skull. I found myself applying old habits to my new confinement. I catalogued the hairline fractures in the plaster ceiling, tracing their paths like rivers on a map, speculating on their origins. A settling foundation, water damage from the storm of '03. I observed a spider in the upper corner of the window frame, methodically spinning its web. I admired its patience, its economy of movement. It was a creature of purpose, its world defined by the anchor points of its silk. I felt a strange kinship with it. We were both prisoners of architecture, both weaving our own small realities within a larger, indifferent structure. I could remember a boy, Marcus, a wiry kid with a talent for picking locks. He could look at a keyhole and visualize the tumblers inside, see the mechanism in his mind's eye. I had tried to channel that talent, giving him broken clocks and radios to fix. It was about redirecting a skill from deconstruction to construction. I felt like one of those broken clocks now. My own mainspring snapped, waiting for a hand to either fix me or discard me. I knew my daughter Jennifer was on her way. The thought did not bring comfort. It brought a sense of clinical anticipation, the way I used to feel before a parole board hearing. I knew a performance was coming, a series of moves on a chessboard I could no longer physically command. My relationship with Jennifer had become a thing of carefully managed expectations and unspoken disappointments. I saw in her a hunger that I recognized from some of my most difficult cases, a focus on the acquisition of things that left little room for sentiment. Her concern, I suspected, would be perfectly articulated, but functionally hollow, a well-rehearsed script. The old house, this repository of my life with Sarah, was, in her eyes, an asset, an inheritance, and I, in my current state, was an obstacle, an inconvenient variable in a financial equation. The afternoon light had now reached the far wall, its golden hue deepening to a burnished orange. The house grew colder. I shifted my weight, and a sharp electric pain shot up from my hip, a stark physical exclamation point to my thoughts. I closed my eyes, breathing through it, my jaw set. The pain was a fact, an undeniable piece of data. It was the foundation upon which the coming battle would be built. It was a weakness, yes, but any good strategist knows that a perceived weakness can also be the most effective camouflage. I was not a dying old man. I was Everett Blackwood, and I was simply observing the board before making my first move. I heard the sound of her car long before she reached the front door. It was a low, guttural purr, the sound of an expensive German engine, a sound that never failed to feel alien against the quiet backdrop of my neighborhood. It was the sound of my daughter, Jennifer. I listened to the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the precise, solid thud of a heavy car door closing, followed by the sharp, impatient click of heels on the stone walkway. Each sound was a data point, an announcement of the carefully curated identity she had built for herself. The woman who arrived was not the girl I had raised. The door downstairs opened and closed, and a moment later, her scent preceded her into the room, a complex floral perfume that was too loud for the quiet scent of old books and lemon oil that usually defined my home. It was an invasion, a colonization of the very air I breathed. She appeared in the doorway, a vision of tailored cashmere and muted grays. Her hair was immaculate, her face a mask of perfectly applied concern, the kind one sees on television news anchors reporting a distant tragedy. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as her mother's, swept the room, but they didn't truly see me. Not at first. They performed a rapid, efficient inventory of the space, the antique bed frame, the worn Persian rug, the silver-backed brush set Sarah had left on the dresser. Her gaze was that of an appraiser, not a daughter. I remained perfectly still, my breathing even, my hands resting on top of the crisp sheets. I had interviewed thousands of young men in my office at Northwood, boys who had mastered the art of the deceptive facade. I knew how to wait, how to let the performance unfold and reveal its own inconsistencies. Jennifer finally let her eyes land on me, and the concern in them intensified, becoming a focused, high-resolution image of sorrow. She glided to my bedside, placing a heavy branded paper bag on the nightstand. The aroma of gourmet takeout, something with truffle oil and roasted garlic, wafted out, another foreign element in my simple world. She began unpacking the containers, her movements deft and proprietary, arranging them on the small table as if staging a magazine photo. She had always been like this, even as a child, organizing her dolls and toys into perfect, static displays. She never played with them in a way that suggested imagination or chaos. She curated them. Now I was just another object to be managed, a problem to be neatly packaged and put away. As she moved, her sleeve brushed against the old chipped porcelain music box that had been hers as a girl. For a fraction of a second, her motion hitched. My mind was pulled back 40 years to a rainy afternoon in this very room. A 6-year-old Jennifer, her face streaked with genuine tears, had brought me the music box. Its delicate ballerina snapped off at the ankle. She had looked at me with absolute faith, her small hands placing the broken pieces in my palm, certain that I could make it whole again. I had spent that entire evening at my workbench in the garage, meticulously gluing the tiny slipper back onto the fragile leg, my large, clumsy fingers feeling impossibly delicate. When I gave it back to her, her smile had been a thing of pure, uncalculated joy. Looking at her now, at the sophisticated, calculating woman who barely registered the object's existence beyond its potential as a dusty nuisance, I felt the vast, cold distance of those intervening years. The memory was a sharp, painful splinter beneath the surface of the present moment. Her survey of the room continued under the guise of tidying up. She adjusted a slightly crooked photograph on the wall, one of me and Sarah on our wedding day. Her fingers, tipped with perfectly manicured, blood-red nails, lingered on the silver frame for a moment too long. She ran a single judgmental finger along the top of a bookshelf, inspecting the light film of dust it came away with. Every gesture was an unspoken accusation, an entry in the ledger she was compiling against me. The house is too much for you. You can't even keep it clean. You are failing. You are not safe here. She was building her case, brick by silent brick, and I was to be the star witness for my own prosecution. She moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to let in more light, and stared out at the garden. I knew what she saw. Not the rose bushes I tended in Sarah's memory, but a half-acre of prime real estate, a green asset that could be subdivided and sold. The setting sun caught the diamond on her finger, and it flashed with a cold, predatory light. Her visit lasted exactly 47 minutes. I timed it by the methodical march of the grandfather clock in the hall, its deep, resonant chime marking the quarter hours. Her efficiency was remarkable. In that time, she had established the narrative of my incompetence, assessed the value of my worldly goods, and performed the role of the dutiful daughter. Her business concluded, she checked the slim, glowing screen of her phone. Her expression shifted, the mask of concern momentarily replaced by the focused frown of a CEO reviewing quarterly reports. Her other life, her real life, was calling. She turned back to me, the mask snapping back into place. She adjusted my pillows, an act that felt more like an assertion of control than an offer of comfort. Her hand rested on my shoulder for a brief, weightless moment. Her skin was cool. There was no warmth in the touch, no connection. It was the perfunctory gesture of a stranger. Then, she was gone. The click of her heels receded down the hall. The front door closed with that same solid finality, and the expensive engine purred back to life, fading into the distance. The room was quiet again, but the silence she left behind was different. It was heavy, thick with the residue of her ambition. The smell of her perfume still hung in the air, a cloying, artificial sweetness. I lay in my bed, the untouched containers of food cooling on my nightstand, and I began my own assessment. The betrayal was no longer a vague premonition. It was a clear and present fact. The game had been declared. The house was a tomb after she left. Night fell, not gently, but like a heavy velvet shroud dropped over the windows, smothering the last of the day's gray light. The containers of food Jennifer had brought sat on my nightstand, their contents cold and congealed. The smell of truffle oil had soured, mixing with the scent of her perfume that still clung to the air, a chemical ghost of her presence. I lay there in the oppressive dark, listening to the ancient conversation of the house, the creak of a floorboard upstairs, the low groan of the water heater in the basement. For the first time since the fall, a feeling colder and heavier than the pain in my hip settled deep in my chest. It was the icy weight of despair, a complete and profound sense of abandonment. The physical helplessness was a cage, but this emotional blow was the locking of the door. My daughter had looked at my life's home, at my wife's memory, at me, and had seen only an obstacle to be removed. My mind, a restless prisoner, began to pace the corridors of the past. It returned, as it often did, to Northwood. I saw the faces of the boys, a procession of anger, fear, and misplaced bravado. I remembered their manipulations, their intricate cons, the carefully constructed narratives of innocence they would spin in my office. I had spent a lifetime deconstructing these facades, looking for the flicker of truth behind the hardened eyes. I remembered a boy named Leo, a gifted artist who could forge a permission slip so perfectly, even his own mother was fooled. I remembered another, Kevin, who had orchestrated a complex system of barter and blackmail within his dormitory that would have impressed a Wall Street trader. They had been formidable, their minds sharpened by necessity and neglect. I had respected their ingenuity even as I worked to redirect it. And now, I saw the same patterns, the same cold calculus, in my own flesh and blood. Jennifer's performance of concern had been a forgery as skilled as any of Leo's, her strategy as ruthlessly transactional as Kevin's. The realization was a bitter acid in my throat. I had spent my career trying to build character in the sons of strangers, only to watch it crumble in my own daughter. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hall began to chime, its deep, sonorous gongs counting out the 11th hour. Each note was a heavy, deliberate thing, a testament to order and predictability in a world that had suddenly dissolved into chaos. I listened to the whirring of the gears between each chime, the sound of a complex, beautiful machine functioning exactly as it was designed to. The sound cut through the fog of my despair. It was the sound of a system of weights and balances, of tension and release. A problem that had been solved with logic and precision. My work had been about creating systems for boys who had only ever known chaos. My life with Sarah had been a system of shared love and mutual support. Jennifer was not an emotional tragedy. She was a system failure. She was a variable operating on a predictable, if distasteful, algorithm of pure self-interest. The thought was cold, devoid of sentiment, and it was the first solid thing I had to hold on to all night. My breathing deepened, slowed. The emotional storm began to recede, leaving behind a strange and terrible clarity. I was a strategist again. My bedroom was no longer a prison. It was an observation post. My immobility was not a weakness. It was a disguise, a cloak of perceived senility that would make her careless. I began to analyze the problem, breaking it down into its component parts, just as I had taught my boys to do with the broken engines and clocks I gave them to repair. The objective? Retain my home and my autonomy. The adversary? My daughter Jennifer. Her weakness? Overconfidence and a fundamental underestimation of her target. My assets? Decades of experience in reading human behavior, a methodical mind, and the element of surprise. She would make a move soon. She would need a professional opinion to validate her claim that I was unfit to live alone. A doctor, a social worker, a therapist. She would find someone she could influence, someone whose integrity could be bought for the right price. She believed everyone had a price, because she did. And in that assumption, I found the first crack in her armor. My mind sifted through the archives of my memory, searching. I wasn't looking for anger or sadness anymore. I was looking for a tool, a piece of leverage. The faces of the boys flickered past again, hundreds of them. And then, one stopped. The image sharpened in my mind with perfect clarity. A skinny, defiant kid with old eyes and perpetually scuffed knuckles. His file had landed on my desk, flagged as a lost cause. Father in prison for financial crimes, mother long gone. He was angry, fiercely intelligent, and loyal to a fault if you could ever earn his trust. He resisted every program, fought every rule. I had taken a different approach with him. I had found him in the library one day, staring at a diagram of a pocket watch escapement. I saw a flicker of curiosity, the first I had ever seen in him. The next day, I brought him an old, broken Waltham from my desk. I didn't enroll him in a class. I just sat with him, hour after hour, taking it apart, cleaning each tiny gear, explaining the physics of the mainspring, the delicate dance of the balance wheel. We rarely spoke of his case. We spoke of mechanics, of systems, of how even the most damaged mechanism could be restored with patience and understanding. I remembered his name, Jacob Matthews, a name I had not thought of in 20 years. And I remembered the day he left, a young man, not a boy, shaking my hand with a firm, steady grip. He had looked me in the eye and said he was going to make something of himself, that he would repay the time I had invested. It was a promise, a small forgotten piece of the past, but in the cold, strategic darkness of my room, it felt like a key. I did not know how, not yet, but I knew the board was set, and I finally knew the piece I needed to make my first move. The pain in my hip was still there, a dull, throbbing bass note, but above it, I could hear the faint, clear music of a plan beginning to form. A week passed in a slow, monotonous crawl. I used the time to study my own weakness, to learn the geography of my new limitations. I practiced the tremor in my hand until it looked authentic, the slight, vacant droop of my jaw, the way my eyes would drift out of focus as if chasing a half-forgotten thought. I was becoming the role Jennifer had cast for me, inhabiting the shell of a feeble old man. I was preparing. On the 8th day, I heard her car again, its engine a familiar harbinger, but this time the sounds were different. 2 car doors slammed. 2 sets of footsteps crunched on the gravel. One was the sharp staccato rhythm of Jennifer's heels. The other was heavier, slower, more deliberate. My heart, a sluggish and unreliable organ, gave a single hard thump against my ribs. The guest had arrived. Jennifer led him into the room. She stood slightly ahead of him, a general presenting her chosen battlefield. I kept my gaze low, my head tilted at a slight angle against the pillows, peering at him from beneath my eyelids. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, filling out the crisp, practical fabric of his therapist's uniform. But the face was the same, weathered by 20 years of life, but fundamentally unchanged. The same intense, dark eyes that had once glared at me across a chessboard in my office. The same stubborn set of his jaw. The hands, now resting on the strap of a medical bag, were the same hands I had taught to reassemble the delicate inner workings of a clock, strong, steady, and capable. It was him, Jacob Matthews. He did not look at me, his gaze fixed professionally on a point just over my head as Jennifer began her performance. She spoke, though her words were a low murmur, directed not at me, but at him. I was an exhibit, a piece of evidence to be presented. I watched her hands as she talked. They were eloquent, carving the air, painting a picture of my fragility. She pointed to the empty space on the wall where I'd had to brace myself during a dizzy spell. She gestured toward the bathroom, her expression a carefully crafted pantomime of the dangers that lurked on the slick tile floor. She was not merely describing my condition, she was building a narrative, a closing argument for my incarceration in a care facility. Then I saw the move I had been waiting for. As she spoke of the significant bonus for a thorough and accurate assessment, her fingers brushed against the clasp of her designer handbag. It was a subtle, almost unconscious gesture, but to me it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the tell. The bribe was on the table, shimmering invisibly in the air between them. Throughout this, I watched Jacob. I was looking for a flicker of recognition, a sign that he saw past the wreckage of my 78 years to the man who had sat with him in the quiet hum of the workshop. But his face was a perfect mask of professional neutrality. He nodded at the appropriate times, his expression conveying only mild clinical interest. He was good. He had learned the art of the impassive facade, a critical skill for survival in the world he had grown up in, and, I supposed, in the one he inhabited now. Yet I saw things Jennifer could not. I saw the minute tightening of the muscle in his jaw as she mentioned the bonus. I saw the way his knuckles went white for a fraction of a second as he gripped the strap of his bag. I saw him glance, just once, at the old Waltham clock on my mantelpiece, the very first one we had ever repaired together. His mask was nearly perfect, but I was the one who had taught him how to build it. I knew where to look for the seams. He approached the bed. His movements were calm and professional. He exuded a quiet competence that seemed to fluster Jennifer. She was accustomed to being the sole authority in any room. He began his initial assessment, his hands gently probing the muscles in my leg, testing my range of motion. His touch was firm, but impersonal. I let my body go limp, my responses sluggish, groaning softly as if in immense pain from the slightest movement. I focused on my breathing, making it shallow, the ragged breath of a man whose energy was a dwindling resource. As his hands worked, I stared at a point on the ceiling, my eyes unfocused, my mind a blank slate. Or so I appeared. In reality, my senses were firing on all cylinders. I cataloged the scent of antiseptic on his hands, the quiet rustle of his uniform, the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse I could feel faintly through his fingertips when he checked my wrist. He was calm. He was in control of himself. The angry, volatile boy was gone, replaced by a disciplined man. As he finished, he made his first direct eye contact with me. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, his professional gaze held mine. I let my own expression remain vacant, confused, the look of a man lost in the fog of his own home. But in the depths of his eyes, I saw it. It was not recognition in the way Jennifer would have understood it. It was something deeper, a momentary flash of the past, a shadow of an old memory acknowledged and then instantly suppressed. He knew. He knew who I was. And in that single silent moment, I knew he remembered the lessons we had shared, lessons not just about gears and springs, but about integrity and honor. He broke eye contact, turning to Jennifer to give a brief, non-committal summary of his initial findings, using technical jargon that meant nothing and everything. She nodded, satisfied, seeing only a hired professional ready to do her bidding. She saw the tool. I saw the weapon. She escorted him out, her heels clicking with the sound of triumph. I lay in the silence, the faint scent of antiseptic now mingling with her perfume. The first move had been played, and he hadn't folded. The sessions began a structured, thrice-weekly ritual. Jacob would arrive with the quiet punctuality of a man who respected the mechanics of time. He would unpack his equipment, resistance bands, a small goniometer to measure angles, a clipboard of charts, with an economy of motion that I remembered from his hands at the workshop bench. To him, I was patient file 3B, a case study in geriatric fragility. To me, these sessions were a theater of memory, each prescribed movement a catalyst for the ghosts of another time. I performed my role with painstaking dedication. When he instructed me to lift my leg, I would produce a pathetic, trembling effort, my muscles feigning a weakness my will refused to accept. When he gave me a sequence of 3 simple exercises, I would invariably forget the second, my face a mask of furrowed, apologetic confusion. I was a ruin, and I made sure every cracked stone and crumbling pillar of my performance was visible to him. With each session, the physical present grew thin, and the past bled through, summoned by the smallest sensory details. The cool clinical smell of the antiseptic gel he used on his hands was the smell of the Northwood Infirmary, and I was suddenly seeing him not as a therapist, but as a 14-year-old boy with a split lip and a blazing, defiant fury in his eyes after a yard fight. He had sat on the examination table refusing to speak, refusing to give up the names of the other boys. I had seen not just anger in him then, but a hard, misshapen stone of loyalty. I had seen something worth salvaging. Now, as those same hands, older and steadier, gently manipulated my atrophied leg, the irony was a palpable thing. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. I, who had once held the keys to his freedom, was now utterly dependent on his physical strength to even sit up in bed. He would guide me through the exercises, his voice a low, patient monotone. "Lift slowly, Mr. Blackwood. Just to here. Now hold." The formal address was a wall between us, a professional necessity. But as I lay there, feigning a struggle to hold a simple position, my mind was not in the bedroom. I was back in the dusty, sunlit quiet of the workshop at Northwood. I saw his teenage hands, clumsy at first, fumbling with the tiny, delicate gears of a carriage clock. I saw his frustration, a familiar storm cloud gathering on his face. I remembered reaching over, not to do it for him, but to place my finger on the back of his hand, steadying it, guiding his tweezer-wielding fingers until the escape wheel clicked perfectly into its jewel socket. I remembered the small, sharp intake of his breath, a sound of surprise and satisfaction. It was the first time I had ever seen him create something instead of breaking it. That tiny click had been the sound of a lock turning, opening a door in him that had been bolted shut for years. During one session, while I was resting between exercises, he set up a small folding chair to make notes on his clipboard. The deliberate, methodical scratching of his pen on the paper echoed across the quiet room. It was a sound that transported me to the long, quiet evenings we had spent in my office, a chessboard between us. He had been a reckless player at first, all aggressive, impulsive attacks, sacrificing valuable pieces for short-term gains. He played chess the way he lived his life. I never simply beat him. I would let his attacks play out, force him to see the inevitable consequences of his moves 3 and 4 steps ahead. I taught him to control the center, to value the humble pawn, to understand that sometimes the most powerful move was to simply wait. I was not teaching him chess. I was teaching him strategy, patience, foresight. I was giving him the tools to dismantle the cage of his own temper. I remembered one game, late into the night, when he had finally seen it. He had sacrificed his knight to lure my queen into a trap, a move of such subtle, patient cunning that I had felt a swell of profound pride. He had not gloated. He had simply looked up at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I had given him a slow, single nod of affirmation. In that moment, we were not warden and inmate. We were equals. I was pulled back to the present by Jacob clearing his throat. My eyes refocused to find him watching me, his professional mask firmly in place, but his gaze was analytical, searching. Had my own mask slipped? Had a shadow of memory flickered across my vacant features? I immediately let my head loll to the side, a soft, weary sigh escaping my lips, as if the effort of merely existing was overwhelming. He looked away, back to his notes, the moment passing. But I knew he had seen something. He was an observer now, just as I had been. He was collecting data, and not all of it was about muscle atrophy and range of motion. Each session was a silent conversation between the man I was pretending to be and the boy I knew he remembered. He was testing my weakness, and I was testing his strength. Not the strength in his arms, but the strength of his character, the resilience of the foundation I had helped him build, stone by painstaking stone, all those years ago. The phase of passive observation had reached its limit. My performance as a fading patriarch was well established, but it was a static defense. A plan, like any good clockwork mechanism, requires forward motion, a transfer of energy from one gear to the next. It was time to apply a subtle, consistent pressure, to introduce new variables into the system that only one other person in the room could possibly understand. It was time to stop waiting for the past to bleed through and to start deliberately pulling it into the present. My strategy shifted from mere performance to active psychological warfare, waged in the quiet, sterile theater of my bedroom. My weapons were not words, but objects. My ammunition was memory. Before Jacob's next scheduled visit, I undertook a difficult and painful maneuver. Gritting my teeth against the fire in my hip, I managed to pivot and reach the lower shelf of my nightstand, my fingers fumbling for a specific volume. It was a heavy, leather-bound book, its spine cracked with age. The Theory of Horology. It was the same edition from which I had taught him the difference between a detent escapement and a lever escapement. I dragged the book onto the bed and, with calculated effort, placed it on the corner of the nightstand, partially covered by a box of tissues, as if it were a casual piece of bedside reading. When Jacob arrived, I feigned a light, wheezing sleep. Through the slits of my eyelids, I watched him set up his equipment. His movements were fluid and practiced, but as he turned to my bedside, his eyes fell upon the book. It was an almost imperceptible pause, a momentary freeze in the rhythm of his actions. His gaze lingered on the gold-leaf title for a full 2 seconds before he seemed to catch himself, his professional mask snapping back into place. He did not mention it. He did not touch it. But the first signal had been sent. A single clear note had been struck in the quiet room, a note only he could hear. For our next session, I prepared a more complex stage. The night before, in a long, agonizing series of small movements, I had managed to get my old cherrywood chess set from the closet. I didn't just place it on the small table by the window, I set up the pieces. I recreated the board from a game we had studied together more than a dozen times, a classic match from 1851, known as the Immortal Game. It was famous for a spectacular queen sacrifice, a lesson I had used to teach him about calculated risk, and the idea that sometimes you had to give up your most powerful piece to achieve victory. The position was dramatic, unmistakable to anyone who knew the game. When Jacob walked in that day, he stopped cold just inside the doorway. His eyes locked on the chessboard across the room. It was more than a pause this time. It was a full stop, a complete cessation of momentum. I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, as clear as a struck match in a dark room. He saw not just a game, but the dozens of hours of lessons it represented. His gaze shifted from the board to me, and for a moment, his expression was stripped of all professionalism. It was a look of pure, unadulterated confusion, of a man seeing a ghost in broad daylight. He recovered quickly, his features settling back into their neutral mask, but his movements for the rest of the session were stiffer, more deliberate. He was rattled. The second signal had been received. The final piece I deployed was the most personal. It was a small, interlocking wooden puzzle, a 6-piece burr I had given him on the day he was released from Northwood. The lesson it carried was one of patience and seeing a problem from multiple angles. It had taken him nearly a week to solve it back then. I had kept a duplicate for myself. With another Herculean effort, I had retrieved it from a drawer and placed it on the far corner of my dresser, partially hidden behind a silver picture frame. It was not in plain sight like the chessboard, but positioned so that he would inevitably see it as he was packing his bag to leave. The session proceeded as usual, his professionalism even more rigid than before. his avoidance of my gaze more pronounced. He was building his walls higher. As he finished and turned to gather his things, his back was to me. I watched his shoulders as his eyes found the puzzle. I saw them tense, a sudden sharp intake of breath so quiet I almost missed it. He stood frozen for a long moment, his hand hovering over his medical bag. I could feel the internal war raging within him. This was not an intellectual artifact like the book or the chessboard. This was a gift, a personal connection, a tangible piece of the past that spoke of trust and belief. He finally packed his bag, his movements jerky and abrupt. He left the room without his customary neutral nod in my direction. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me in a silence that was now charged with unspoken history. The room was no longer just a sick room. It was a museum of our shared past, each exhibit a silent accusation against the deception he was being paid to perform. The pressure was no longer a gentle nudge. It was a firm, insistent weight. I had laid my cards on the table, face up. The next move was his. The silent war of objects had reached its strategic limit. The book, the chessboard, the puzzle. They had sown the seeds of memory and discord, but I needed more than a troubled conscience. I needed a confirmation. I needed to see the foundations I had laid 20 years ago, and know, with certainty, that they still held firm against the corrupting pressures of the world. Jennifer's phone calls to Jacob had become more frequent. I would hear the low murmur of his end of the conversations from the hall before our sessions began. Her impatience was growing, and with it, her generosity. I knew that the weight of her promises was bearing down on him. Subtlety was no longer sufficient. I needed to force a moment of undeniable truth, a revelation that would compel him to choose his allegiance. The time had come for the final, most dangerous signal, one that could not be misinterpreted or ignored. From a heavy box of old photographs tucked away in the bottom of my wardrobe, I selected my instrument. It took me the better part of an afternoon, a painstaking and exhausting effort that left me trembling and drenched in a cold sweat, but I retrieved it. The photograph was small, its corners softened with age. It showed a younger, vital version of myself, my hair still dark, standing beside a gaunt, unsmiling teenager in the Northwood workshop. A half-finished grandfather clock, the product of a year-long project, stood behind us. I remembered the day it was taken. It was the day Jacob had finally perfected the moon phase complication, a task of immense precision he had initially declared impossible. In the photograph, my hand rested on his shoulder, a gesture of approval. His own hands were held stiffly at his sides, but in them he clutched a small, polished brass pendulum. He was not smiling, but for the first time, the defiant anger in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, smoldering pride. Before his next visit, I slipped the photograph beneath a book on my nightstand, a loaded weapon waiting for the opportune moment. He arrived with his now familiar professional calm, but I could sense the tension humming just beneath the surface. His movements were precise, almost robotic, and he avoided my gaze more studiously than ever. He was a man walking a tightrope, and I was about to shake the wire. We proceeded through the first half of the session in our established pantomime of therapist and patient. I performed my weakness, my confusion, my pain. He performed his dispassionate, clinical care. I waited, watching his every move, anticipating the perfect moment. It came when he leaned in close to check the alignment of my hip, his attention focused entirely on the angle of my leg. My world narrowed to that single critical action. With a sudden theatrical jerk, I feigned a violent muscle spasm. My arm flailed out, my hand sweeping across the surface of the nightstand. The book, the glass of water, the tissue box, all of it went crashing to the floor in a cacophony of shattering glass and clattering plastic. My performance was flawless. A sharp, agonized cry escaped my lips, my body twisting in sham agony. Jacob reacted instantly, his professional instincts taking over, moving to steady me. But my eyes were on the floor. Amid the mess, The small rectangular photograph had slid free of the book. It lay face up on the dark wood of the floor, a pale island in a sea of clutter, directly in his line of sight. Time seemed to slow down. The sound in the room ceased to exist. I watched his face. He finished ensuring I was stable, his hands firm on my shoulders, and then his gaze dropped to the floor. He saw the spill, the broken glass, and then he saw the photograph. He froze. All motion, all professionalism, all pretense stopped. I saw his eyes widen, a flicker of disbelief followed by a wave of stark, undeniable recognition. The carefully constructed wall of the therapist crumbled, and for a long, silent moment, he was just a man staring at a ghost from his own past. The boy with the brass pendulum was looking up at him from the floor, and the man beside the boy was lying in the bed before him. The connection was absolute, a circuit finally completed. Slowly, as if moving through water, he knelt down. His hand, the same hand I had once guided, trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached past the shards of glass and picked up the photograph. He stayed there on one knee, staring at the image, his face a turbulent canvas of emotions I could read as clearly as a page of text. Shock, memory, guilt. He looked up from the photograph and met my eyes. In that moment, I dropped my own mask. I let the vacant, confused fog lift from my expression and looked at him with the same clear, steady gaze I had used in my office all those years ago. I did not need to speak. My eyes said everything. I know who you are. I remember. Do you? After an eternity, he swallowed, a dry, difficult motion. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture toward the photograph in his hand. Turn it over. He seemed to understand instantly. His thumb and forefinger moved, flipping the small cardboard rectangle. I knew what he was seeing, because I had written it there the night before in my shaky but clear handwriting. 5 words. The parts must still be true. It was the phrase I had used when we found a stripped gear in that old clock, the principle that a complex system could only function if its core components were sound. He read the words, and I saw his shoulders, which had been tense and hunched, relax, and then square. A decision had been made. The battle within him was over. He had chosen his side. He rose to his feet, his face now calm, composed, but with a new, hard resolve in his eyes. He carefully placed the photograph on the one clear corner of the dresser, face up, a silent declaration. He did not speak. He simply turned and began, with quiet efficiency, to clean up the mess I had made. The session after the revelation of the photograph was a silent reset, a recalibration of our entire dynamic. Jacob arrived with the same professional demeanor, his bag of tools in hand, but the air in the room had changed. The brittle tension of our previous encounters had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, shared purpose that was as tangible as the furniture. His professionalism was no longer a wall between us. It was a curtain, a carefully maintained stagecraft for an audience of one, my daughter, who was not present, but whose influence was a constant, unseen force. I was no longer an exhibit to be assessed. I was a collaborator, and the therapy, which had been a theater of weakness, was about to become a clandestine training ground. He began the session as he always did, with simple range of motion exercises. But this time, everything was different. As he gently lifted my leg, his hand on my thigh, his thumb pressed down twice, a firm, deliberate signal. It was a pressure that had no medical purpose, a clear, non-verbal instruction. Push. For real. On the surface, he was the therapist, and I was the patient. But beneath the cover of the starched white sheet, a silent conversation was taking place. I responded to his signal, engaging my quadriceps, pushing against his hand with a flicker of my former strength. A groan escaped my lips, but this time it was not entirely feigned. It was the sound of atrophied muscle firing to life, a sound of painful, welcome effort. Jacob's face remained a neutral mask, and on his clipboard, I saw his pen move, noting involuntary muscle spasm. We were building the official record, lie by meticulous lie, while underneath, the truth was one of reconstruction. Our communication evolved into a subtle, unspoken language. A slight, almost imperceptible nod from him as he demonstrated an exercise meant that this was one I should practice on my own, in the quiet hours between his visits. When he showed me a diagram on his clipboard, his finger would trace the official, simple movement, but his eyes would flick to a point higher on the page, indicating the true goal I should be striving for. A tap on his own temple was a reminder to focus, to push through the pain. We were a two-man conspiracy operating in plain sight. He was no longer just a physical therapist. He had become my trainer, my coach, my strategist. He was using the very process meant to certify my weakness as the tool to restore my strength. The irony was immense, a perfectly balanced and beautiful mechanism of its own. My body, which I had begun to think of as a traitorous vessel, slowly started to respond. The deep, grinding pain in my hip was still a constant companion, but it was now joined by the clean, sharp ache of exertion, the satisfying burn of muscle fibers being torn down and rebuilt stronger. I would lie in bed after he left, my leg trembling with exhaustion, sweat beading on my brow, and feel a profound sense of accomplishment. Each session was a battle, and each small increase in strength was a victory. He would meticulously document my failures, my lack of progress, my increasing dependency, creating a fraudulent paper trail that would lead Jennifer ever deeper into her own deception. The true turning point, the moment I knew our alliance was forged in unbendable steel, came during our 4th session under this new pact. In the middle of an exercise, Jacob's phone buzzed in his pocket. He excused himself with a neutral glance, stepping into the hallway to take the call. I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was Jennifer. I could not hear his words, but I had a clear view of his silhouette through the doorway. I watched him listen, his posture relaxed. Then I saw him subtly shift. His shoulders slumped slightly, his head tilted in an attitude of professional sympathy. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of grim news being delivered. He paced a short step, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck in a perfect pantomime of a man grappling with a difficult prognosis. He was playing his part for her, with the same focus and dedication he was applying to my real recovery. He was actively feeding her the narrative she wanted to hear, lulling her into a state of absolute confidence, while in my room, I was slowly, painfully, learning to stand again. He was building my body and dismantling her plan with the same quiet, methodical efficiency. When he returned to the room, his face was impassive, but as he met my gaze, he gave a single, slow blink. A confirmation. The deception is working. That night, long after he had gone, fueled by a grim determination I had not felt in years, I pushed myself. Using the techniques he had secretly taught me, I leveraged my own weight, ignored the screaming protest of my hip, and for the first time since the fall, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I sat there, unaided, in the silent, moonlit room, my feet planted firmly on the floor. My body was shaking. The pain was a roaring fire, but I was upright. I looked at my hands, resting on my knees, no longer trembling with feigned weakness, but clenched into tight, steady fists. The turning point had been reached. I was no longer a prisoner in my own bed. I was a man in training for a war. Our sessions settled into a rhythm that was as intricate and secretly synchronized as the workings of a fine watch. On the surface, the tick-tock was one of monotonous decline, a steady march toward the inevitable conclusion Jennifer had paid for. But beneath the faceplate, a different mechanism was turning. A complex interplay of hidden gears and tensions was working toward a completely opposite end. We had become masters of our shared deception. My feigned groans were now perfectly timed. my collapses into a chair theatrically convincing. Jacob's notes grew more pessimistic with each visit, his charts filled with the data of my fabricated deterioration. He would write, "significant cognitive lag," when I had just successfully followed a complex, 5-part instruction he had given me with his eyes. He would note, "severe muscle wasting," on the very day I had managed to hold a wall sit for a full, agonizing 30 seconds. The progress I made in the secret spaces of our sessions was real, and it was brutal. Every inch of regained mobility was purchased with a currency of sweat and searing pain. There was a morning when Jacob brought in a simple walker, a tool meant to be a symbol of my dependence. For the official record, he documented my inability to even pull myself to a standing position using it. He wrote that my attempts resulted in uncontrolled tremors and risk of falling. The truth was that after he guided me up, his hands providing the bare minimum of support, I had stood on my own 2 feet for the first time in nearly a month. And then, while he acted as a spotter, his hands hovering near my back, I took a step, and another. Each one was a monumental effort, a negotiation with gravity and agony. By the time I shuffled the few feet from my bed to the window, my body was screaming, but my will was silent and serene. We were rebuilding me, piece by methodical piece, right under my daughter's nose. The threads that bound us were not merely ones of conspiracy. They began to weave themselves into a tapestry of quiet camaraderie, of a shared humanity that existed entirely in the spaces between our actions. The alliance, born of a debt from the past, was now being nurtured in the present. Jacob would arrive some mornings, and after our session, I would find he had forgotten a thermos on my nightstand. It was always filled with strong black coffee, brewed the way Sarah used to make it, a taste of a life I thought was lost to me. Other times, it would be a newspaper, folded neatly to the crossword puzzle, which he knew I had once completed every single day. These were not the actions of a therapist. They were the gestures of a friend, of a son. They were small, silent acknowledgments of the man, not the patient, and they were a fuel far more potent than any medicine. I, in turn, communicated back in the languages I had left to me. The chessboard became our silent correspondence. Before one session, I arranged the pieces into a classic King's Gambit accepted, a bold, high-risk opening. It was my way of asking if our strategy was too aggressive, if we were exposing ourselves. When Jacob arrived, he saw the board, and before our session began, while my back was turned, he moved a single black pawn, declining the gambit, shifting the game into a quieter, more solid defensive line. The message was clear: patience. Let her make the mistakes. On another day, using a small toolkit I had kept in a drawer, I spent an hour meticulously tightening and oiling the casters on his therapy stool, which had developed an annoying squeak. It was a small act of maintenance, a horologist's gesture. When he sat down and the stool rolled silently across the floor, he glanced at me with a look that transcended our roles. It was a shared look of mutual respect between two men who understood the value of a well-oiled machine. Jennifer's calls continued, and I would take them on the speakerphone Jacob had set up for me, my voice a frail, quavering instrument of deception. I would sound confused, forget her name for a moment, my performance bolstered by the knowledge that Jacob's reports were corroborating this picture of my decay. She was growing more confident, her tone shifting from feigned concern to a barely concealed impatience. She was a predator circling a kill she believed to be finished, unaware that the animal was not only healing, but sharpening its claws. The invisible threads of our alliance were pulling tighter with each passing day. They were the threads of a shared past, of a debt being repaid, not with money, but with integrity. They were the threads of a silent, coded language of chess pieces and coffee cups, and they were the threads of a net, strong and unseen, that was slowly, patiently, being drawn around my daughter. My growing physical strength was a key, one that began to unlock the doors of my own house. The clandestine journeys started small, a painful, shuffling walk to the bathroom without the aid of the walker, then a slow, deliberate patrol of the upstairs hallway, my hand ghosting along the wall for support. My objective was my study, the room that had for decades been the seat of my authority and the sanctuary of my thoughts. Reaching it for the first time was a monumental victory. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, the scent of old leather, paper, and cedar wood enveloping me like a long-lost coat. I stood there for a long moment, breathing it in, a general returning to his command tent. The strategic landscape of my war was about to expand beyond the confines of my sick room. The nature of my requests to Jacob began to change. Our silent communication, once focused on the mechanics of muscle and bone, now shifted to the logistics of information. On a small, discreetly passed note, I had written a simple list. During his next visit, Jacob's medical bag seemed heavier. As he unpacked the usual resistance bands and measuring tools, he also, without ceremony, placed a slim, unmarked laptop and a small burner phone on the far side of my bed, shielding the action with his own body. It was a seamless transfer, a spycraft trade executed in the quiet intimacy of the therapy session. He was now more than my physical therapist. He was my quartermaster, my only link to the outside world, supplying the tools I needed to survey the terrain of my daughter's life. My nights transformed. While the house slept, I would make the slow, arduous pilgrimage to my study. The pain was a constant, burning companion, but my purpose was a formidable anesthetic. Under the narrow beam of my old brass desk lamp, the real work began. I was a man accustomed to research, to the meticulous construction of a case file from disparate, often hidden, pieces of a life. For 34 years, I had built dossiers on troubled boys to understand them. Now I was building one on my own daughter. I started with the tangible past, unlocking a file cabinet filled with old tax returns and bank statements, documents from a time when her life and mine were still intertwined. I was searching for a baseline, a starting point from which her current desperation had grown. I found the name of the bank that had financed her first failed boutique, the names of partners in her husband's disastrous tech startup. These were the first threads. With the laptop Jacob had provided, I began to pull on them. I was not a man of the modern digital age, but I was a man of logic and systems. I learned the pathways of public records databases, of county clerk websites, of online business registries. My fingers, stiff with age, moved slowly over the keyboard, but my mind moved quickly. I cross-referenced names and dates, building a web of connections. A picture began to emerge, not in a sudden revelation, but piece by painstaking piece, like a photograph developing in a dark room. I found liens filed against her design company. I discovered a string of short-lived LLCs, each one formed and dissolved in a matter of months, a classic shell game. I unearthed articles from local business journals detailing a luxury condominium project she had championed, a project that had stalled and collapsed, leaving a trail of angry investors. Jacob became my eyes and ears. I would give him a note with an address, and he would provide the intelligence. A business address I found for her latest venture, he reported back with a subtle shake of his head and a gesture of emptiness. The office was a vacant storefront, a ghost company. A name of a former business associate I uncovered, he returned with a note of his own, tucked into the pages of a medical journal he left for me. The note contained a single, damning word: indicted. He never asked questions. He simply took my intelligence requests and returned with facts. He was the perfect operative, loyal, discreet, and efficient. The dossier itself was a simple, unmarked manila folder I kept hidden in a hollowed-out legal encyclopedia on my bookshelf. Inside, the evidence accumulated. I printed out articles, screenshots of legal filings, and property records. I wrote my own notes on connecting pages, drawing lines between names, companies, and dates. The file grew thicker, heavier. It was more than a collection of facts. It was the story of her greed, her arrogance, and her desperation. It was a precise and damning portrait of the character flaws that had led her to my bedside, to see her own father not as a person, but as a final, liquid asset to be seized. One night, deep in the digital labyrinth of court filings, I found the keystone. A notice of default on a massive private loan, with my house listed as the sole collateral in a personal guarantee she had illegally forged my signature on. Her timeline was no longer just impatient. It was a deadline. If she could not have me declared incompetent and seize control of the estate, she would lose everything. I printed the document. The ink was still warm as I slipped it into the folder. I closed the dossier and sat back in my leather chair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The weapon was complete. The day of the final assessment arrived not with a storm, but with the crisp, indifferent clarity of a late autumn morning. There was no longer any need for me to inhabit the shell of a feeble man. My pain was a manageable, dull ache, a quiet reminder of the battle I had fought and won in the privacy of my own home. I was not in my bed, nor was I in my sick clothes. I sat in my high-backed leather armchair in the living room, a room I had not truly occupied in months, dressed in gray flannel trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a navy cardigan. My shoes were polished. Beside my chair on a small mahogany side table sat a cup of black coffee, from which I took slow, deliberate sips. I was not a patient awaiting a verdict. I was a warden awaiting a prisoner. Jacob arrived first. He was dressed not in his therapist's scrubs, but in a simple dark suit and tie. He carried a polished leather briefcase. He gave me a single steady nod as he entered and took a seat in the chair opposite mine. There was no need for any further communication. Every part of the mechanism had been cleaned, oiled, and assembled. We were simply waiting for the mainspring to be wound. The dossier, that thick manila folder filled with the architecture of my daughter's ruin, rested inside his briefcase. Between our chairs, the air was still and charged with a silent, cold energy. Jennifer's expensive car crunched on the gravel driveway precisely on time. She was not alone. A man in a tailored suit, carrying his own briefcase, followed a half-step behind her. Her lawyer. Her confidence was a palpable force as she swept into the room, her expression a mixture of performative sympathy and triumphant avarice. She saw me sitting in the chair, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise crossed her features. But she dismissed it instantly, likely interpreting it as a final pathetic attempt at dignity. She did not greet me. She addressed herself entirely to Jacob, a queen addressing a courtier whose services were about to be rewarded and concluded. With an imperious wave of her hand, she indicated that he should present his findings. Jacob leaned forward, unlatched his briefcase, and retrieved a slim, professionally bound document. He did not hand it to Jennifer. He placed it firmly on the polished coffee table in front of her. Her smile was tight, victorious. Her lawyer shifted his weight, ready to proceed with the legalities. Jennifer picked up the report, the crisp white cover seeming to gleam in the morning light. I watched her face as she began to read. I had spent a lifetime reading faces, and hers was a particularly transparent text. I saw the first subtle furrowing of her brow as she read the summary page, a slight confusion that quickly morphed into disbelief. Her eyes darted from the page to Jacob, whose own face was a mask of calm, professional neutrality. She flipped the page, her movements becoming sharp, frantic. I could see the charts from across the room, the upward trajectories of my strength and mobility, the undeniable data of my recovery. Her knuckles, clutching the report, were white. The triumphant flush in her cheeks was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a pale, waxy pallor. As she stared, dumbfounded, at the irrefutable proof of Jacob's betrayal, I set my coffee cup down on its saucer. The small, sharp clink of porcelain on porcelain was the only sound in the room. Then I placed my hands on the arms of my chair, and with a smooth, controlled motion, I pushed myself to my feet. I stood there for a moment, tall and steady. Jennifer's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a horrified shock that was more satisfying than any shout of anger could ever be. I held her gaze for a single, long beat. Then, I turned and walked, without a limp, without a tremor, across the room to the large bay window that overlooked Sarah's garden. I stood there, my back to them for a moment, looking out at the last of the autumn roses. Then I turned and walked back to my chair, my steps even and measured on the old Persian rug. I did not sit. I remained standing, a living, breathing refutation of her entire scheme. Her jaw was slack, her carefully constructed composure utterly shattered. She looked from my standing form to the useless report in her hands. The lawyer beside her was frozen, a statue of baffled uselessness. The house of cards she had so carefully built had just been hit by a gale-force wind. And then, Jacob delivered the final, crushing blow. He reached back into his briefcase and retrieved the second file, the simple manila folder. He placed it on the table in front of her, directly on top of his official report. He opened it to the last page I had inserted, the forged loan guarantee. He placed one steady finger on the signature, my name written in a clumsy, unfamiliar hand, and then tapped the line below it, where her own signature was a flamboyant, confident scrawl. There was no recovery from that. I watched as the last vestiges of color drained from her face, leaving it a ghastly, bloodless white. Her breath hitched, a tiny, strangled sound. Her eyes, which had been filled with such arrogant certainty only moments before, were now wide with pure, animal panic. She looked at the document, then at Jacob's implacable face, and finally, at me. In my eyes, she found no mercy. She found no anger. She found only the cold, quiet satisfaction of a long-overdue equation finally being balanced. Her lawyer, seeing the document, took an involuntary step backward, his own face a mask of professional horror as he recognized the magnitude of the crime before him. Jennifer scrambled to her feet, her movements clumsy, panicked. The report slid from her lap onto the floor. She did not look back. She and her lawyer practically fled the room, a rout of absolute, ignominious defeat. The front door slammed shut behind them. I stood in the silent living room, the abandoned report lying on the floor like a casualty of war. The victory was quiet, and it was complete. In the profound silence that followed the slamming of the front door, the living room felt like the site of a concluded treaty. The air, once thick with tension, was now thin and still. The abandoned report lay on the floor, a testament to a battle won. Jacob knelt, not with the deference of an employee, but with the quiet dignity of a partner, and gathered the scattered pages. He closed the manila folder on the table, its contents no longer a weapon, but a historical document, an artifact of a war that was over. Our eyes met for a moment over the polished wood of the table. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a deep, abiding calm. He had upheld his end of a promise made 20 years ago, closing a circle I had never imagined would be completed. He straightened the chairs, erasing the last physical evidence of the confrontation, restoring order to the room as he had helped restore it to my life. After he left, I did not remain in the living room. I began a slow, deliberate patrol of my own house. I walked through the dining room, my hand trailing along the dusty surface of the great mahogany table where my family had once gathered for holiday meals. I continued into the kitchen, the afternoon light glinting off the familiar porcelain of Sarah's teacups, still neatly arranged in their cabinet. I was not inspecting the property. I was reclaiming my territory, re-establishing my presence in a space that had almost been stolen from me. Every room was filled with the ghosts of a life that had been, but for the first time since my fall, they felt like my ghosts again. In the upstairs hallway, I stopped before a framed photograph of Jennifer as a little girl, taken on her first day of school. She was all missing teeth and unrestrained joy, her small hand clutching a lunchbox. I looked at the image of the child she had been, a child who had believed her father could fix anything and felt a profound and hollow ache. There was no anger left, only a vast, empty sense of loss. The daughter I had raised was as much a ghost as her mother now. I had not just defeated an adversary, I had officiated the funeral of my only child. The news of her public unraveling came to me in fragments, delivered without comment. A week after the confrontation, Jacob arrived for one of his now regular visits. He brought not a medical bag, but a bag of groceries and a newspaper. He placed the paper on the kitchen table, folded to the business section, before he began putting away the food. Later, after he had gone, I read the small column of text at the bottom of the page. It was a sterile, factual report of a prominent local design firm, Jennifer's, filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The article mentioned allegations of financial impropriety and multiple pending lawsuits from investors. I read the words with the detached curiosity of a stranger reading about a distant misfortune. Her name on the page seemed to belong to someone I had once known, long ago. There was no satisfaction, no vindication. It was simply the logical conclusion of a flawed system, the final, predictable collapse of a poorly built structure. Our visits transformed. The pretense of therapy was gone, replaced by the quiet, comfortable routine of friendship. Jacob would come by on his days off. We would sit in the garden, the autumn air crisp around us, and I would tell him about the different varieties of roses Sarah had planted. We played chess, our games long, silent battles of strategy and foresight, a continuation of the lessons we had started decades ago. He was a formidable opponent now, his style a reflection of the man he had become, patient, defensive, but with a capacity for sudden, decisive attacks. One Saturday, he did not come alone. A woman with a kind smile and a young boy with Jacob's intense, dark eyes stood with him on the porch. His family. I watched as the boy explored the garden with a child's boundless curiosity, his small hands gently touching the petals of a rose, and I felt not the pain of my own loss, but the quiet, unexpected warmth of a new connection being forged. I found a new kind of peace in those days, a peace built not on happiness, but on acceptance. My victory had not brought joy, it had brought stillness, it had brought freedom. I had won back my home, my independence, my dignity. But the cost had been the final, irrevocable shattering of my own family. The shards of that old life were all around me, glinting in the light, and they could never be pieced back together. I did not mourn this. I simply accepted it. Standing in the cool evening air, looking at the sturdy, quiet house that was unequivocally mine, I felt the weight of my 78 years, the sum of my successes and my failures. I had my home, I had my honor, and I had a loyal friend. It was more than many men had. It was enough. The seasons turned, and the raw, jagged edges of the preceding months softened into a seamless, quiet rhythm. My life, which had been so violently thrown from its tracks, settled back into a familiar groove. But the groove itself felt deeper, more defined. The world had not changed, but my perception of it had been irrevocably altered. I now moved through my days with a deliberate appreciation for the simple mechanics of existence. The act of rising from my bed in the morning, my hip now a map of dull, forgettable aches instead of a nexus of fire, was a small, silent victory. I savored each dawn. The aroma of brewing coffee, the solid weight of the morning newspaper in my hands, the freedom to walk into my garden under my own power. These were no longer mere routines, but privileges that I had fought for and won back. My house was quiet again, but the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer the hollow, waiting silence of a prison or the heavy, grief-laden silence that had followed Sarah's passing. It was a clean, placid quiet, the contented silence of a library or a workshop after a long day's work. The steady metronomic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was the house's heartbeat, a sound I had come to associate with order, with reason, with the reliable progression of time. I would spend hours in my study, not consumed by the frantic energy of building a case, but simply reading. I revisited the Stoics, the histories, the biographies of great strategists, finding a new resonance in their tales of adversity and resilience. My home was my fortress once more, but its walls were no longer defensive. They were simply the peaceful, established boundaries of my world. I did not think of Jennifer. That is not to say that the memory of her did not exist, but it had become like an old, sealed file in the deep archives of my mind. It was a case that had been investigated, adjudicated, and closed. There was no anger, no lingering bitterness, only the calm, dispassionate acknowledgement of a conclusion reached. Her absence was a fact, like the empty chair at the dining room table, or the silence from her side of the family on holidays. It was a space that could not be filled, and I no longer felt the need to try. My life had been a long and complex equation, and she had been a variable that, in the final calculation, had simply been canceled out. My connection to Jacob and his family became a quiet, sturdy anchor in my new life. Their visits were unannounced, casual, and woven into the fabric of my weeks. Jacob would appear one afternoon with a toolbox and, without a word, spend an hour fixing the sticking sash on the old window in the kitchen, an act of practical, filial devotion. His wife would bring me containers of stew that tasted of a warm and bustling home, a home unlike the quiet one I now kept. Their son, a boy with Jacob's watchful eyes, grew comfortable in my house. I once found him sitting on the floor of my study, utterly absorbed, trying to solve the old 6-piece wooden puzzle I had left on a low shelf. I watched him struggle with it, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I saw a perfect, unbroken circle form. The lessons of patience and logic, passed from me to his father, were now being discovered anew by the next generation. I did not interfere. I simply let him learn. Sarah's garden became the truest reflection of my inner state. I spent most of my days there, kneeling on a soft pad that Jacob had brought me, my hands in the cool, dark earth. I learned the rhythms of the soil, the needs of each individual rosebush, the silent, ongoing war against the weeds. It was methodical, honest work. It was a system that responded to care and attention with predictable, beautiful results. Pruning the dead wood in the late fall, I felt a sense of purpose. I was not destroying, but making way for new growth. I was tending to a legacy, not just of my wife's, but of my own. My peace was not a state of blissful happiness. It was something more durable, more real. It was the quiet satisfaction of a well-repaired mechanism, the deep tranquility of a well-tended garden, the solid, unshakable peace of a man who had faced the void and had chosen to build something in its place. I would sit on the back porch as the sun went down, the air growing cool, and I would feel the profound stillness of my life. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I was free, and it was enough.